Hello, welcome to another episode of History Hack. Alex, of course, is bouncing off the walls. Alex, tell us why you're bouncing off the walls.
Because this is something I did for my A-level, and it's exciting because it's a different take on it. So Dan Spencer is an independent researcher of medieval and early modern military history with a focus on, wait for it, castles, artillery fortifications, and gunpowder weapons. So big, bangy things, as Peter Hart would call them. Hi, Dan. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Yourself?
Oh, yeah, we're all right. This is the end of a long week of recording, but we're still going strong. We have a lot of non-British listeners, so we're going to talk about your new book, but I feel we have to get something out of the way first, just to give them a rundown and let them know what's going on and where we are in history. So first of all, I guess, can you set the scene for the Wars of the Roses for us? Why, when, and who?
Okay, so the Wars of the Roses is a label given to approximately 30-year period of dynastic conflict and upheaval, covering most of the second half of the 15th century between the rival houses of Lancaster and York. The traditional start date is 1455, the first armed clash at the First Battle at St Albans, whereas the wars are said to have ended in 1485 with the victory of Henry Tudor at the Battle of Bosworth Field. In terms of the causes, these include dynastic issues, which really go back all the way to the overthrow of Richard II in 1399 and his replacement by his cousin Henry IV, as well as economic and political problems. So Henry VI was a weak king, his government was unpopular, and there were all sorts of issues caused by the defeat of the English in France during the 100 Years' War, and there was feuding amongst the nobility. So historians have divided up the wars, hence, Wars of the Roses, in different ways, but essentially you start off with Yorkist rebellions in the 1450s, in which Richard, Duke of York, a cousin of the king who had a firm claim to the throne, sought to gain control of the government of Henry VI and to be recognised as his heir. Then in 1459, you have the outbreak of civil war, which leads to a series of battles between both sides. York attempted to claim the throne, but he was killed at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460. The civil war finally culminated in the victory of his eldest son, Edward, Earl of March, at the Battle of Towton, and his coronation as Edward IV in 1461. Then throughout the 1460s, Edward IV continued to face rebellions from Lancastrians who refused to accept his right to the throne, particularly in the north and in Wales. And these rebels received assistance from the French and the Scots, who were more than happy to cause problems for the English. Resistance was only finally subdued in 1468 with the capture of Harlech Castle in northwest Wales. Then, in 1469, hostilities are resumed because the Yorkists essentially fall out amongst themselves, leading to an alliance between Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, who up until this point was Edward's biggest ally, and the Lancastrians. This led to Edward losing his throne in 1470, where Henry VI briefly restored to the throne, before in the following year, Edward returned to England, defeated his enemies at the Battle at Barnet and Tewkesbury, and regained his throne. Then from 1472 to 82, you have a period in which Edward IV, in his second reign, was firmly in charge on the throne. By this point, most of the principal Lancastrians are dead. So the wars are seemingly over with the Yorkists victorious. And this allows Edward to engage much more in international politics. And he engages in wars with France and Scotland. Then in 1483, Edward IV rather unexpectedly dies. And once again, this causes problems amongst the Yorkists. His brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, ends up imprisoning his son, Edward's son, Edward V, and claims the throne as Richard III. But he in turn faces lots of opposition to his rule, and eventually he's defeated and killed by Henry Tudor at the Battle of Bosworth, who ascends to the throne as Henry VII. Then from 1485 onwards, there's a series of Yorkist pretenders to the throne, and I stop with the Battle of Stoke in 1487, which is the last pitched battle of the wars.
So, Alina, who's tearing her hair out right now, Edward IV is Henry VIII's granddad. And it's where he gets the big hulking ginger man genes from, to put it into context for you. And Edward V, you do know, because he's one of the princes in the tower.
Oh, okay, that's fine. I'm getting this. As long as we're getting the Edwards right.
Yeah, Alina's got a bad track record of Edwards. Yeah, she thought Edward VI was George V's son, so that prompted much laughter and mockery. But yeah, just so that's where we are in history. This Edward IV, that's the big cheese in all of this, is Henry VIII's granddad, and the Edward V is in the Tower with his brother. So we're just before, and then the guy that wins it all eventually in 1485, Henry VII, that's Henry VIII's dad.
Okay, I'm on it. I think I'm on it.
Is that enough? Is that enough to tell you where we are and where we're at?
I think so. I think watching, what was that program? The one with the woman and
the White Queen, is it, or something?
That's the one.
Yeah. I might have known it'd be some girly historical fiction thing that you would tie this to in your mad brain.
That's as close as I'm going to get, I think. But I think I've got it. I think I'm on it.
Right.
Okay. Right. Okay. So my question is, why is your book different?
Well, basically, it's this story which is told from a different perspective. So I'm focusing on castles and their role in the Wars of the Roses, and it's probably worthwhile mentioning what a castle is.
Yeah, give us a definition at this period in history.
Well, okay. So the word castle derives from the Latin words castra or castellum, meaning fortress, and they were introduced by the Normans to the British Isles in the 11th century. Now, the most basic and traditional definition is that these were private fortified residences. So these are private as opposed to public fortifications. So they're different to, let's say, urban town walls. And they were fortified structures built in a particular style. So they often have, walls, towers, gatehouses, ditches, all those sorts of things. But they were also residential in nature. So at the very least, they're dual purpose buildings, not simply forts. So they're also important as centres of estates, local administration, justice and status symbols. So by the time we get to the mid-1450s, the Wars of the Roses, they've been around in medieval society for a long time. And these are sort of very large, visually imposing structures, which sort of dominated their landscape. And they're also very different as well. So some of them are very old structures that incorporated old and new architectural elements and that have been gradually adapted over time, whereas others were much more new ones. In terms of numbers, we're talking about in the hundreds by the mid-15th century, whereas in previous centuries, they've been as high as in the thousands. And they were generally speaking owned by the king, nobility, various bishops, even some monasteries, and the gentry. So basically, the ruling landed elites owned these structures. And they vary between, so to say, major royal and aristocratic castles, such as, say, the Tower of London, Kenilworth, Alnwick, Ludlow, the really sort of famous, well-known ones, to much more modest, smaller ones, such as Caister and Bodiam, which were owned by the gentry. And in this era, we still have some castle building going on, but it's much more focused on building and rebuilding existing sites.
I think the standard historical line, I think at this point, is that the role of the castle is in decline, or the military value of a castle is in decline by this point in the mid-15th century. So are they important in the Wars of the Roses?
Yes, so I think the view is that the campaigns of the Wars of the Roses were dominated by decisive battles, in which, castles played a very minor role. That's been what most people really thought in the past. Now, this argument does have some substance to it, because it's actually quite an unusual era, particularly in medieval history, for the frequency with which battles took place. Nevertheless, my argument, slightly more nuanced one, is that this really doesn't tell the whole story, as there were many campaigns in which castles were used in a significant way, and also that the individual wars that made up the Wars of the Roses were all quite different. So in some of them, castles played a more important role in some of them as opposed to the others.
Is it fair to say that you're challenging a broader assumption here that castles are no longer important in the late Middle Ages?
Yes, I mean, that's part of my sort of broader argument, really. So generally speaking, the late Middle Ages are seen as an era in which they're in decline and transition, in which they're no longer really being used so much in warfare, and they're becoming more important in terms of being residences and status symbols. Now, I think this view has some validity to it, because gradually what happens by the early modern period is you see a separation in the military and residential function of the castle. So you end up with forts and country houses. Yet I think in terms of the context of the Wars of Roses, this is only partly relevant because they continue to be used in warfare in the Wars of the Roses and actually still into the 16th century and beyond.
One thing I really like about your book, this gives you an opportunity to shed light on some of the more obscure campaigns in the Wars of the Roses, doesn't it? So can you tell us about them and how castles come into play?
Yeah, sure. So, the big battles, say Taunton in 1461, Bosworth in 1485, get a lot of attention, and they did even, at the time from the contemporary sources. But I personally find some of the more minor campaigns more interesting. Particularly ones that took place in the more remote parts of the kingdom, such as in Wales and Northern England. So one of my favourite episodes is the Yorkish invasion of Wales in the summer of 1461. So this took place in the aftermath of the decisive Yorkist victory at Taunton in spring of that year. So by this point, Henry VI and most of his remaining supporters had fled to Scotland, but the Lancastrians still controlled many castles across the kingdom, especially in Wales. So Edward IV advocated the castle subduing Wales to some of his most trusted supporters, which they duly carried out. Now, the narrative sources have very little to say about this campaign, so it's been generally characterised by historians as being effectively a whitewash, the Yorkists invading Wales and quickly capturing all the major castles. So what we need to do really is recreate it by using other sources, which is what I've done by using, let's say, mainly administrative and financial records. And these sources show that it was actually a very mixed picture, what happened. So essentially, some places surrendered very quickly to the Yorkists, so such as the castles of Pembroke and Tenby in the southwest, whereas others in, particularly in the north, such as Rutland and Conwy, were only taken after sieges. And other areas I'm particularly interested in are the state of civil war between 1459 and 61. So after the Yorkist victory at the Battle of Taunton in 1460, the country was effectively divided. So the Yorkists were dominant in the south and the Midlands, whereas the Lancastrians were dominant in the north and in Wales. The Yorkists had Henry VI, but their opponents were the Fiends. And you effectively have a Cold War, I suppose effectively a sort of Cold War era before we get to the Battle of Taunton. And then another area that I'm very interested in is in the years 1461 to 4, in which you have a protracted struggle for Northern England, especially Northumberland, in which castles played an important role.
So a standard nerdy question from both of us, because we like to be nerdy on this podcast. Let's be fair. Tell us about your sources, and did you make any interesting discoveries?
Yes, sure. So I've tried to use as many sources as possible. Some of these have been well known, so they've been used by other historians previously, whereas others haven't been. And I think this is one of the reasons why the role of the castle has been undervalued. It's due to the nature of the sources we have. So quite frankly, I think many of the narrative sources we have for this particular period aren't as good as ones from, let's say, earlier or later centuries. So some of the most useful narrative sources we have were written by, effectively by members of the London civic elite. These authors were very well informed, but unsurprisingly, they were very London-centric in their focus. So what this means is certain campaigns and episodes tend to be overlooked. So to sort of rectify this, really, I've tried to sort of look at other types of sources that perhaps haven't received quite as much attention. So in particular, I've been using financial accounts for this. So one's compiled by, let's say, clerks working for the Exchequer, which is the main royal treasury of the English crown at this time, or in royal lordships. And these sorts of documents have all sorts of interesting information about items of expenditure. So we get information on, let's say, the wages of soldiers or the purchasing military equipment. And in some cases, these type of records provide the only information we have about certain campaigns and episodes. So I spent a lot of time in the past going to the National Archives, trawling through all these sorts of documents, trying to find interesting nuggets of information. So one of my personal, I think, favourite discoveries really was when I was looking at the financial accounts of the Chamberlain of Chester and Flintshire for 1461 to 2. And these reveal that Sir William Stanley, who was a rather interesting character in the Wars of the Roses, they show that he was given the task of subduing Lancastrian resistance in northeast Wales. And it includes some really interesting details about hitherto unknown siege of Rutland Castle. They show that he carefully planned the operation, and he actually sent 2 men from his headquarters in Chester to Warwickshire to seek the advice of the king for the forthcoming operation. And they also showed that the siege involved a force of nearly 500 men accompanied by artillery, who besieged the castle for 13 days, after which the defenders surrendered, with Nicholas Worrell, who was the commander of the Lancastrian garrison, and the other members of the garrison then being sent to Chester before being sent on to London with Stanley. Other ones include, I found a letter which was sent in the name of Edward of Westminster, I'm afraid another Edward, who was the young son of the king, to his father Henry VI in 1460, which shows that in the aftermath of a Yorkist rebellion in the Marches of Wales, that the Lancastrians were sort of placing multiple garrisons in the castles they occupied in that region. One of the most frustrating things, though, is the evidence we get is often rather incomplete. So I found an intriguing petition which refers to the storming of Conwy Castle in northwest Wales in 1461, but it's very unclear exactly what transpired.
I love it. What for you, in all the stuff you found, what would you say is the crowning moment for the castle in the Wars of the Roses?
Yeah, I think probably my favourite episode is the siege of Bamburgh Castle in 1464, because it's actually a very, I suppose, exceptional siege in that the besiegers actually captured it by storming it, and we have a wonderfully detailed narrative account of what went on. So this account basically describes how effectively the Yorkists approached the castle. They sent 2 heralds to demand the surrender of the garrison, who offered letters of pardon to all defenders, bar the leader of the Lancastrian garrison, who had basically been too much of a turncoat to be offered that opportunity. And then what happened basically is Sir Ralph Grey, who was defending the castle, refused this offer. So the Yorkists opened up their guns on the castle, which caused, quite a lot of damage to the fortifications. So it describes how bits of masonry were flying off into the seas below. And then under cover of this firepower, the Yorkists launched a full-scale assault, and they gradually overwhelmed the defenders and captured it. They took Sir Ralph Grey, as I said, was the commander of the Lancastrian garrison, prisoner, rather unfortunately for him, because then he was then taken 150 miles southwards to Doncaster, where he was put on trial for treason and was beheaded.
No one wants to be sent to Doncaster either, do they? So I've just made enemies all over the north of England as well. Of all the places they're going to round you up and send you, that would not be my choice. To be fair to Doncaster, I've only ever seen it because I've been through the train station on my way further north on a train. I'm sure it has many charms.
Do you know what? I was going to say something really witty there, but I'm going to avoid that.
But then you remembered it's you. So
then I remembered it's me and I can't say anything witty.
Sorry, Dan, this is just what we're like.
No, that's fine.
Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Dan, have you visited any cool castle? Let's start again. Have you visited any cool castles? See, tongue-tied again. What's actually left that people can see?
Oh, what are these castles?
Yeah.
It depends. I mean, I've tried to visit as many of them as possible when I was researching for this book. It really varies because there are some places which don't, effectively nothing survives. For others, they've continued they've been used, up until the modern day. So Alnwick Castle in Northumberland, which in the 15th century belonged to the Percy family, still belongs to the Percy family.
It's Hogwarts, isn't it?
It is, yeah. That's suddenly occurred to me.
There you go, Alina. Now she's interested. Alnwick Castle is Hogwarts. Well,
yay,
the
Harry
parts
Potter.
of Hogwarts that aren't
CGI. Unfortunately, a lot of castles in this country that are in ruins. And a lot of that really, I suppose, dates, it's actually a problem it actually comes from the 17th century. So during the English Civil Wars, as a result of that, a lot of them were deliberately destroyed. But even so, though, even with those castles, the ruins look very nice. I'm actually quite a fan of romantic ruins, as it were.
Yeah, sometimes the ruins are cool.
Yeah, exactly. I much prefer ruins really to stately homes, if I'm being honest.
See, I've got a thing about photographing monasteries, of which, thanks to Henry VIII, there are many ruined monasteries. Yeah. So you fly the flag for recognising the impact of castles, but you are a proper historian, so I want to give you the opportunity to measure that, because I know you wouldn't come on here and go, castles are amazing and they were the most important thing in the whole world. Castles aren't just about sieges, are they? They play a wider supporting military role in the Wars of the Roses.
Yeah, definitely. So to go back to sieges, I tried to count up how many there were.
Okay.
So I found that there were at least 36 definite ones that took place over this sort of 30-year period.
So it is significant, isn't it? And it is something that's been missed.
Yes. I think generally speaking, people have sort of recognised maybe a few sieges perhaps, but then thought, well, these are exceptional events.
Yeah.
Whereas
So I'm a First World War historian, though, and I know that all of the stately homes in France basically were seized as headquarters and things. Were they doing that with castles?
Oh, yeah, certainly. Yes, and in fact, even beyond the sieges, I found evidence of lots of castles being garrisoned.
Okay.
And due to the problems with the evidence, I expect the figure was actually even higher. So I found evidence for at least 65, but I reckon, that's an underestimate. But yeah, they were certainly being used as headquarters in campaigns. So Kenilworth Castle in Warwickshire was used as the royalist headquarters for campaigns in the 1450s. Sometimes you even had occupied castles being used in this way. So in the winter of 1462, Richard Neville, the Kingmaker, was rather busy. He was from his headquarters at Warkworth Castle. He, on a daily basis, was said to supervise the sieges of the nearby castles of Alnwick, Bamburgh and Dunstanburgh. So effectively, the Yorkists were besieging 3 castles at the same time, and he had allocated the lieutenants to besiege each one. And then on a daily basis, he was supposed to be riding between each castle to check how they were getting on, as it were.
I don't know. I'm trying to wrap my head around all of this. So
this is a war. These wars, this 30-year period, didn't exist in her head until 20 minutes ago when we started talking to you. So she's a bit like, oh.
That's okay. No, I know it is complicated. Even when I was writing it, to be honest, it's difficult sometimes to keep track exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
Okay, so castles are not just significant in a military context either, though, are they? Oh,
no, completely not, no. They were very highly prized by the land-owning elite. And it wasn't just because they were of economic value, so they're the centres of these grand estates, but also because they were of great symbolic importance as well. So frequently, the aristocracy were trying to get hold of these castles, and actually that's what contributed to some of the basically the underlying causes that led to the outbreak of war in the 1450s. So in the 1440s and 50s, you had effectively feuds amongst the magnates. So the Percys and the Nevilles, who I mentioned before, they effectively were in dispute over certain castles. So one example of this is Wrestle Castle in Yorkshire, which is something they were both very keen to get hold of. And sometimes you actually had effectively private wars taking place because different landowners were trying to get hold of the same castle. So in 1469, you had the Duke of Norfolk laying siege to Caister Castle. It's not really part of the Wars of the Roses per se, but effectively he was trying to get hold of the castle through using force. And typically kings would try to reward their followers by, dishing out castles they'd confiscated from their enemies. So Edward IV effectively made William Herbert his viceroy in India. In Wales.
Yeah. Going forward a couple of hundred years there.
Yes, whereas effectively he used the Nevilles to effectively act as his lieutenants in the north. And also, as I mentioned before, you still have some castle building going on in this period. So, for instance, William Lord Hastings built Kirby Moxlow in Leicestershire. And then similarly, you have William Lord Herbert carrying out major works at Raglan Castle in Monmouthshire. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. So.
Yeah, there's lots going on, isn't there? I'm trying to think of my favourite castle. I don't think it's Wars of the Roses. It would just be Windsor, because I do all the work there in the Royal Archive, so I'm completely biased towards Windsor Castle, which obviously is lucky enough to have been massively looked after. But I do remember a school trip to Rochester as well, which was quite cool, because that's all crumbly, isn't it?
I am a fan of Rochester, yeah.
Do you want to know what my new thing is now in Poland?
Go on.
I'm actually, get this, are you ready? I'm actually looking
scared.
at castles.
Oh, you are?
Oh, wow.
I am. And there's so many beautiful castles out here from all various, medieval to...
Yeah, I went to one.
Later.
Near Krakow.
Yeah, they're so beautiful. So I've actually gotten interested in castles. So thank you to Alex, who's pushed me towards that.
Yeah, who's bludgeoned her with just enough medieval history. Now we just got to get you into boats.
That will never happen.
Dan, tell everybody what the book's called and how they can get hold of a copy.
Yeah, so it's called The Castle in the Wars of the Roses, and it's being published by Pen and Sword. So you can get it from their website or Amazon.
Perfect. Or get your local independent bookshop to order it in.
Of course, even better.
Yeah, because we are on a little obsessive mission now to make people go to their local bookshop. But thank you so much for coming on to give us a different slant on the Wars of the Roses. Well, to give Alina any slant on the Wars of the Roses. It's just a nice little introduction as well.
Thank you for having me on the show.
We are now on YouTube. We are posting all of our new episodes on there, and we have our own channel, and we are gradually posting all of the back episodes because we have been made aware of the fact that you can only find the last 100 on some platforms. So you can go and listen to your heart's content and laugh at the cartoons and have a great time. So do go over there and subscribe. Don't forget, you can become a patron of History Hack for as little as $1 a month. Just go to www.historyhack.podbean.com. It will help us keep going in the aftermath of the coronavirus, and we would really appreciate it, as we would love to do so.